it's centered around a mechanism in the brain that I call the self-appraisal system. We've got a voice in our head that's constantly looking at our actions, looking at the way we're living. The reason why we have these thoughts, the reason why we have self-esteem or care about our own worth, the reason why this is a human universal is because it's an evolved mechanism for assessing our virtues. This mechanism that connects our actions to our happiness and actually produces the kind of chemicals that we associate with being really satisfied in our lives based on the actions we observe ourselves taking. Welcome to the Mindform podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Here's your host, Frank Lawton.
Kia ora from New Zealand. Welcome to another episode of the Mindform podcast, an extension of the Mindform collective and training platform. This podcast is similarly a space dedicated to exploring and altering psychological landscapes together. So in each weekly episode, I'll speak with a new guest, generally members of Mindform, to extract wisdom, refine ideas, and collaborate on the game of architecting our minds. So this week we have Ryan Bush again, the founder of Mindform, author of the book of Self-Mastery, Designing the Mind and Become Who You Are. He's based in North Carolina, USA, with his partner and dogs. Or is it just one dog? Just the one, eh?
Just one dog.
Just the one dog, yeah. And as far as I can tell, he spends his days either hanging out with them, serving the community on Mindform, or refining his knowledge. So Ryan is curious about what leads to eudaimonia, which, if you don't know, is a Greek term approximating psychological flourishing. And his latest book presents a macro strategy for pursuing this goal. That's Become Who You Are, the book. And he calls this theory virtue self-signaling theory. So with that, welcome back to the Mindform podcast, Ryan.
Great to be back, Frank. Thanks for having me.
No worries, man. So just a quick question. What's up for you this week? What have you been contemplating? What philosophical ideas have been stirring in you these past few days?
Well, that's a good question. I have to think back through. I've been I'm thinking a lot about what needs to sort of get done on the business. I'm really focused on applying for grants and getting funding for this Mindform app. Sometimes it feels like I put the philosophical ideas on hold for a while I focus on the pragmatic stuff, which I'm not always too happy about. Sometimes I feel like I would rather just spend all day in contemplation, but I kind of go in phases and switch back and forth. But
well, we wouldn't want all that contemplation to go to waste. It's certainly a balance, and it's fantastic. You've got opportunities to capture it, communicate it. So I think it's a healthy balance. I want to get right into a bit about virtue self-signaling theory. I know you've talked about it on different podcasts before, but I just want to start with, how do you define eudaimonia?
Yeah, so eudaimonia. So this is a term that first appeared in the sort of ancient Greek work of like Socrates and the Stoics, and it really refers to the sort of highest state of mental well-being. It's sometimes translated to happiness. That's not great because it's makes most sense to sort of contrast it with hedonic well-being. You've got hedonia and eudaimonia, and of course hedonic well-being is sort of just this immediate pleasure, things that just feel good right now. Eudaimonia is understood to be a deeper or higher kind of well-being, and the Stoics had a lot of ideas about how that's achieved and what it looks like, and in some ways it's counterintuitive, and it contrasts with a lot of our ideas about what happiness is. But I think it's right. I think it makes the most sense, and we actually, if we strive for eudaimonia as opposed to a vague sense of happiness and feel good, we actually will slowly get closer to the life we would like to be living and the person we would like to be.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that clarifies it pretty well. And I think distinguishing it from happiness is worth doing. I think that I love happiness, and I don't take any issue with happiness. And I would say generally I often use that word to describe my pursuit. But the problem is it's just so low resolution, and I think so much confusion, and even at the level of academia, sort of argument or disagreement between different approaches or different fields comes out of just people using this word and not clarifying exactly what they mean, right? Like, the Buddhists use happiness, they use the term happiness when they speak in English generally, and they're not talking about hedonic pleasure, obviously, because the Buddhist pursuit requires the sacrifice of the pursuit of hedonic pleasure as sort of a prerequisite. But I think a lot of people hear that, that life is about being happy, and they're like, what is this hedonic nonsense? So it's a low resolution term, and I think eudaimonia does capture it well. And also, I don't know, today it just kind of has a vibe of being I don't know, you hear that term, and maybe just because it's Greek or something, you think, oh, okay, so it's a bit classier.
It is classier. Yeah,
it is classier.
There's this idea that is sometimes called the happiness trap that I've written about, and it's sort of caught on that happiness is not a good thing to strive for, and that you shouldn't try to be happy, because the minute you do is when you lose it. And people say, like, happiness is what happens along the way when you're pursuing other things. And while there is definitely a grain of truth to all that I try to reconcile in my work, like, I really think if striving directly for happiness is not leading you there, you're not very good at it yet, which is fine. None of us are that great at it. But essentially, you need to refine your understanding of what you really want and how you get there. Because if you're just going shopping and taking bubble baths and drinking wine and saying these things are how you get happy, and it's not working, well, yeah, that's the expected outcome. But essentially, this whole thing we're discussing here, that the ancient Greeks were discussing, is about how to get to that real deeper layer of happiness. And I think pursuing it directly is a great idea.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. I think we just got a message from a Mindful member, Mufekral, who said eudaimonia is at the process, not the goal. I think that's a good way to define it, or at least that's one of the distinctions that you need to make if you're going to successfully pursue happiness directly. Is like, okay, happiness is how I do things and how I respond to things, not a state of experience coming at me. Do you know what I mean? So focusing on the how, not the what, is probably part of that distinction.
Yeah, it is a good question, and I think it is more process oriented than pure like hedonic pleasure and stuff. But I don't know. It can be seen as a goal too. It's a goal that you want to.
Yeah.
I conceptualize it as like a kind of a landscape with mountains and valleys, and eudaimonia is essentially getting as high up on those mountain peaks as you can. So you want to get up there, and then you want to stay there, right? Or climb higher if possible. So it is an ongoing process, and you can, get up high on this mountain and then, stumble down without even really noticing it. So it is an ongoing pursuit, but it's also something that I think you can spot and aim for too.
Oh yeah, and it's a real state of experience. It's not, it's kind of one of those, maybe language doesn't capture very well, paradox things like, they say, oh, happiness isn't what you're experiencing, it's it comes from how you respond. But it's like, yeah, but if you respond in the way that's going to make you happy, you're experiencing happiness. Like, it's complex. But I think, yes, one of the things about the term process that captures it is that once you get it, you don't keep it, right? The instant you feel happiness suddenly start behaving in a way that's going to make you miserable, your happiness is going to disappear just as quickly.
Right. And Mufakral asked if eudaimonia is always transient. And I would say in the same way that, that a lot of mood states can be transient, it can disappear. That doesn't necessarily mean it will. Personally, I've experienced a pretty high degree of I would say eudaimonia at a few different points in my life, each one, lasting for years. But then I have dropped down before. I have had periods that showed me, oh, I'm not just enlightened. My brain isn't just like magically happy. There are real threats to it, and you do have to sort of be constantly working and not get complacent and defend against those sort of threats to your eudaimonia.
Yeah, although at the same time, I mean, yeah, different obstacles and different unexpected unexpected gaps, I suppose, in one's pursuit to eudaimonia will come up along the long journey. But I would definitely say that you can get better at it. It can get easier. It can become a relatively automatic habit, just like the habits of thought that make us miserable are automatic. Having a habit of thought that makes us stoked, eudaimonic, can certainly be automatic. But still, as soon as you change that behavior, if you choose to, it'll go away again. Yeah, but
yeah,
it can become your
it's
new
not
normal.
that different from another sort of mastery path. Like I've been playing more online chess lately, and
Yeah.
you've kind of got this ranking score wherever you're at, and there's always someone higher than you. But you're constantly trying to master this game and get a little bit better. It's always possible that you will slip up, or you won't practice for a while, and then you'll have a big loss that'll set you back, and you got to kind of work your way back up the ranks. So it is a little bit like use it or lose it, I think. But it's a continual path to mastery, and it's something you're constantly trying to sort of get better at.
Absolutely. Well, with that in mind, we're talking about how is it pursued, the ongoing process. Could you summarize your sort of macro approach philosophy, virtue self-signaling theory, a little bit as an approach to eudaimonia for us?
Yeah. So it's really rooted, at least, the earliest chronologically, it's in this ancient Greek notion. And really, I think they got a lot right. I think, the core idea is that virtue and eudaimonia were tied together. That word virtue, I think, has this kind of old stuffy connotation for us now. But I think it's a really beautiful, rich, sort of colorful thing when you actually understand what they were talking about, right? But essentially, they were saying that if you have these strengths that you exercise regularly, I mean, really, they were primarily concerned with 4 particular virtues, right? Temperance, justice, courage, and wisdom. I've sort of expanded out a little from this, but largely their argument was that if you demonstrate these positive traits, if you maintain these traits, you will achieve this greater level of happiness. And what I always asked when I heard that is kind of like, well, something about this seems right. Intuitively, I feel like something's right, but I want to be able to explain it better. I'm not satisfied with a kind of dogmatic claim that, oh, this is just how. Sorry, did I cut out there? It's saying trying to reconnect.
I can hear you, and
Okay.
the recording seems fine. But maybe go back 10 seconds just in case.
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, where was I at 10 seconds ago?
Say that you were saying that you liked the idea, something sounded right about this connection between virtue and eudaimonia, but you wanted to understand how it works.
Yeah. So really, I'm kind of always trying to take these timeless claims of wisdom that seem right to us, and like it really does seem to line up with experience in a lot of ways, but kind of ask, what is the actual mechanism? What's the evolutionary origin? Why would it be this way? Why is this not just some old dogmatic claim that we're just supposed to take very old people's words for? And so in looking into this and trying to understand it, I sort of dug into evolutionary psychology. I looked into the psychology of well-being, positive psychology, clinical depression, and those types of studies. And I sort of converged on a theory that ties together a lot of these different data points and happens to line up very closely with this ancient account of eudaimonia, right? I call it virtue self-signaling theory. It's pretty easy to summarize in 30 minutes. It's pretty hard to summarize in 30 seconds. So hopefully we can
30
get
seconds
to it.
Ago.
Right.
Come on.
Right. But essentially it tries to explain this link between virtue and well-being, between the traits that we admire in others and in ourselves, and the satisfaction, the deep well-being that we realize. And it's centered around a mechanism in the brain that I call the self-appraisal system. And really, we don't even need to introduce that term to understand it. We're all very familiar with this. We all know that we evaluate ourselves constantly. We've got a voice in our head that's constantly looking at our actions, looking at the way we're living, that thing we did yesterday that was embarrassing, and just way over analyzing ourselves and overthinking. Sometimes it's negative, and that's very much characteristic of depression. It's not always negative, right? You have thoughts that are self-approving and proud too, at least hopefully you do, right? And the idea is that the reason why we have these thoughts, the reason why we have self-esteem or care about our own worth, right? The reason why this is a human universal is because it's an evolved mechanism for assessing our virtues, assessing the strengths that we're bringing out in our behaviors. And I can get into, I think, the very good evolutionary reasons why it evolved. But the point is, I think that we really did evolve this mechanism that connects our actions to our happiness and actually produces the kind of chemicals that we associate with being really satisfied in our lives based on the actions we observe ourselves taking, right? And so there is, I think, a real neurological and evolutionary link between our virtues that we're exercising and our long-term sort of well-being, that how good we feel in our lives and about ourselves.
I think you nailed it. I think that captured most of what I recall from your book and what you've said in different places. Yes, without, I suppose, going too much into the evolutionary grounding, but that is a whole conversation, that one. So, I mean, you said it enhances the brain chemicals, right, that are associated with positive experience or whatever. To me, I'm just thinking of one brain chemical that I see a really clear link with what you're saying, which is serotonin, right? So, and
yeah,
and you've had different people. Obviously, Jordan Peterson is the lobsters and all of that, but it's this chemical that when an organism, in all basically any species that has a social, even the most mild sense of hierarchy or social landscape, when an organism is dominant, successful, has a record of success, basically has evidence that it is effective or thriving, then the serotonin levels go up and it increases, obviously for human beings where we can make that connection, it increases experiential well-being, but it also increases confidence, willingness to take action, all that sort of thing. I see a strong connection there with serotonin. And sort of a part of how I understand serotonin is like an approach, but also like a pride sort of mechanism, or maybe not approach, more like willingness or confidence. But do you see this mechanism, the self-appraisal system, as working through other brain chemicals? And if so, how? Because I see it as being the mechanism for that, for serotonin, and then I have ideas about what works with the other sort of primary well-being neurochemicals, dopamine and oxytocin.
Yeah, so I think it is sort of a coordinated response that our brain makes according to where we evaluate ourselves across a lot of different sort of, the
Yes.
physiological, the affective, the behavioral, right? It's really a full body, full mind response. And so I do think there are a lot of different chemicals associated with it. When we see people who are depressed, they typically have low serotonin. They also typically have low dopamine. They have high cortisol. And so there's a lot of chemicals involved. But yeah, serotonin is really the principal one. That's the one that I think is most interesting to note in all this. And I think you nailed it in terms of how serotonin sort of seems to work. And, it is interesting that there are researchers who have pointed out similar things. And you're right, Jordan Peterson does sort of make this claim that's central about lobsters. And I think he's onto something. I don't quite agree with all of his conclusions that he draws from it. But yeah, when we look at these social species, we do often see there's this sort of ranked hierarchy of who has the most serotonin. Those are usually the dominant ones. Those are the ones with the high status, the highest mate value, right? And that's typically in the animal kingdom, it's purely based on like physical aggressiveness, physical dominance. Clearly, it's not that simple at all with humans. And that's where I think some of these like dominance hierarchy thinkers sort of get it wrong. But I
Yeah,
think
I
it
agree.
is that same sort of mechanism that's adapted to much more complex and socially complex landscapes that we see in humans. Um, but yeah, I think largely you will see lower serotonin levels in people who are closer to the depression end of the spectrum, and high serotonin levels on people who are close to what we're calling eudaimonia here, right? Very high levels of satisfaction and self-satisfaction. It's an important thing to note, but there's just so many directions with all this. I see Mufakro asking about the lobsters.
Oh wow, I missed all these messages.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones.
Oh. Yes, indeed. I might, yeah, I'll keep note of those. I've got my own question here, though. Yeah, he's
Yeah, yeah.
invested. Good on you, Miracle. So I'm curious. So you talk about the self-appraisal system, and we're going a bit into, yeah, sort of like status, social systems, and serotonin when we talk about that. But do you see, are there other mechanisms by which this virtue approach leads to a state of well-being in your mind? So is it all through seeing yourself behave in a way that you value, and thus liking yourself, and your body has this response of creating well-being in you, as sort of because it's seeing you as valuable, or are there other ways that this leads to well-being?
So I think there could be different types of well-being. I'll say that much. I think eudaimonia is linked to this sort of self-evaluation and a positive self-evaluation. I'm pretty convinced of that, and I think depression is caused by the opposite of that, low self-evaluations, essentially. But you could argue that having no self-evaluation, and certainly this has been argued before, is a kind of well-being. Having just no voice in your head analyzing you at all, no sense of self, and that's much more in line with the sort of Eastern Enlightenment notion. I think you can, treat that as an ideal, and certainly it'll be much better than being depressed and being, in a very unpleasant state of mind. My current sort of model for it is that you're sort of neutral on this spectrum, right? You don't have very high serotonin, you don't have a high self-approval, you're also not low, and you're not, you know, castigating yourself constantly. You're sort of just in this no man's land, which could be great if you've never been there before, if you've always been depressed, if you're an Eckhart Tolle type. But ultimately, I think this really is how our well-being evolved to work. I don't think we would even have a state of overall well-being if it weren't for this mechanism that is trying to get us to bring out more of our virtues, ultimately to elevate our social and mate status, right? It's not a very I don't know, you could take a cynical look at the origins of all these things and why our brains evolved this way. But I think it's more interesting to look at how we can take advantage of our brain's wiring, regardless of how it came about, and optimize it and achieve even greater levels of well-being than we were really even necessarily intended to.
Absolutely. Mufakral in the chat just said, lost sense of self can also lead to depression, so perhaps the ego is not the enemy. And yeah, I totally see where he's coming from. I used to, as you know, I mean, we've talked about this on Mindform before, like, I don't agree with your sort of, if depression is -1 and this sort of self-appraisal eudaimonia is +1, then the non-self is 0. I used to think, I used to look in that linear thing, but now I think you're right that there's different kinds of well-being and sort of a movement out of the self-appraisal dynamic. I think you're probably right. I think that having no sense of self doesn't give you this self-appraisal serotonin type of well-being, but I think perhaps it actually facilitates a qualitatively different kind of well-being. And these, I mean, we talk about serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. This is obviously very low resolution. And, people might think this sounds a bit silly, but I sort of have come to understand mindfulness, presence, and sort of, and what one gets out of the movement, out of that dynamic as more of like a dopaminergic kind of positive state. So for example, to me, it's similar to the kind of positive state you get when you're in a highly creative mode or flow state, and when you're stoned. And in both of those cases, dopamine shoots up. But don't get stoned too often, because then dopamine shoots down. But
right.
Not that I know anything about that. But basically, so I see it as sort of working effectively, but on a different mechanism. And so when I think of like, I mean, I've come to really, really appreciate your virtue self-signaling theory. Truly, nothing seems to create a more holistic sense of well-being for me than having, acted today and for the last few days in a way that's aligned with my values consistently. That feels really good. And it also, I've noticed, and I think this speaks to what you say about, it's a whole body, and it's an adapted thing, and the system is like the reason we have well-being as a thing at all. That actually that's serotonergic, or that self-appraisal well-being, facilitates a state of calmness and relaxed thinking that allows me to have a similar kind of well-being without the meditation that meditation gets me, because I'm not the anxiety to make sure that I'm living up to something, I guess, goes away to some degree, and then I can just be, right? Because people talk about mindfulness as being, just instead of trying to become. But if you're confident that you're becoming, then you can just be doing that. So, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a hard sort of theory to communicate, because there are so many points where you can run off and sort of misinterpret. There are a lot of nuances. So I'm not at all against mindfulness and meditation and that whole collection of tools. I think they're incredibly useful, right? I think you can use them to essentially try to quiet your default mode network, try to remove all activity in your self-appraisal system. I think you can also use them as a tool to step back and get distance and actually improve these things, right? The being and becoming are not mutually exclusive. They're very much, they serve one another if you, do it right. And similarly with the serotonin thing, people will run off with that and say, well, okay, but there's evidence that depression isn't caused by a chemical imbalance or whatever. It's not caused by low serotonin. And I have to point out here, no, you're right. It's not caused by low serotonin. There's really no evidence that's the first step in the chain, right? It's a whole connected system, but it is correlated. It's not a causation thing. It's a correlation thing. Depression and low serotonin and low self-esteem and all these other traits are all correlated. But that doesn't mean that you just have some imbalance in your brain, that you were just born wrong, and that's why your serotonin is low. So
no, absolutely. I mean, I think it perhaps just speaks to the fact that whether because of our thinking abilities, our education or whatever, but a lot of people, or in general, we're not equipped to kind of understand such a complex and integrated system. The way I try to understand something like, is it a chemical brain imbalance? Is it your life situation? Is it a thought pattern? Is it, an honest reflection of your behavior? Whatever it is, like depression, I mean, I see it as different faces at which you can observe and measure a whole system, which is really one state, right? I mean, low serotonin and the low mood, it's the same thing. It's just one, you're looking at it from the experience of how I feel, and one, you're looking at the brain chemicals. And the thought patterns come along with that. The life situation comes along with that. And to try to analyze it as a linear line where one of those things is the cause, and the others as the result is, I think, misses the complexity of it for sure. I see John's in the chat as well. Hi, John. And he's asked this question, and it's similar to something Mufakril's asked as well, which is, and River's here. Oh, awesome. Welcome, River. This must be your first time. Yeah, brilliant. And the question seems to be, so John's asked, like, what is it that I want? What do I want for myself? What do I want now? What do I want later? And Mufakril asked something like, how do I know what my values are? And I'm curious, like, what's going on? Like, what are these virtues and values? I mean, you referenced these Stoic ideas of virtues, that if you actualize these, then you experience eudaimonia. But how does one navigate this landscape of different things, different ways of expressing virtue, or different things that they might value? I know you talk about this interplay between value and virtue, so maybe start by laying that out.
Yeah, so I think that values and virtues most of the time are sort of interchangeable, and I think it's fine to use them that way. It's only when we really zoom in that it becomes clear that virtues are fundamentally behavioral and values are fundamentally perceptual. And so, when I'm observing someone else, that's my values and my brain that are saying, oh, I approve of that. I admire how that person's behaving, or I disapprove of that, right? And when it's me taking action, I'm the one who possesses the virtues, right? And someone else might have their set of values and admire me for it. And so you could call it the male end and the female end, if you will, but essentially just like an outlet, essentially. But I guess the question becomes, well, what are your values and what are your virtues? Your virtues are the things that you are good at, right? They're the areas of strength in many cases that you've had since you were very young. Your values are the things you approve of or admire in others. I think that there's a major universal thread throughout, humanity. Essentially, there are some things that we pretty much universally value. But I also think it varies a little bit from one person to another, and those can be pretty consequential differences. So how you find out was it values or virtues that Mufakril was asking about? Your virtues. So the way there are a few different ways you would identify your virtues. One is you probably have a list in your head already. You probably have some things in mind that you're like, yeah, I'm good at this, this, and this. But it's probably a pretty incomplete list. There are probably some things that you've been good at for a long time that you've either overlooked or that's been suppressed. You've gone through a standardized school system that's caused you to devalue or forget about some of those things because they're just not incentivized in that system. So there are a few different things you can do. You can take a Strengths Finder test. I recommend Martin Seligman's sort of virtues in action test. You can, ask a bunch of your friends and family members, what do you think I'm good at? They'll often tell you something you weren't really thinking about before. And so all these things can help you build out a list. I've talked about a lot of this stuff, with values. If you want to identify what you value, which might actually be harder than your virtues, you can create a list of people you most admire and write down the traits you really admire about them, and then gradually sort of break that down, cluster and recategorize until you've got a list of things that feels right to you. And even the list is, oversimplifying and splitting apart what's really this unique territory of your own personal values and virtues that's really not like anyone else's. But so those are some of the specific methods for getting clarity on this. But then, putting them into action is sort of another question and requires some strategic thinking along with that clarity.
Yeah, I remember when I did my second 10-day meditation course, having this sort of realization or whatever as I was walking around the sort of the native New Zealand gardens that they have set up there. It's really lovely. And well, I had a friend who passed away, and I definitely talked about that on there before because it's just a big part of my journey, I guess. And I was thinking about what it is that defines a person's unique value, and sort of the language that I used in that was it's what they love, and it's the pathway they utilize to pursue that, and that's sort of the special thing. Like, in a way, you are what you love, and I think what you value. I think that's basic. I'm saying the same thing. So for the example of my friend, which I think is how I started thinking about this stuff at the time, is he really, really loved beauty and, like, I guess vibes is the right word, like crafting beautiful experiences, and experiences with a unique personality, a unique character that's memorable and connects people. And then his virtues were the ability to craft that and the ability to support people into those states. And that's sort of what, when he left the world, that's what left the world. That was that was a big part of what made him him, and what was this value that's now gone forever, right? Because we're all a very unique combination of what is it that we love, what is it that we value, and then how is it that we pursue that. And so, I don't know, I guess I can just say, speaking from my own experience, that comes across as really true to me, not only as sort of this virtue value thing, not only as an individual pathway to flourishing or eudaimonia, but also as characteristic of what it is that defines your unique value, or your unique path, as well as your values and your virtues.
I think that's a good way of putting it. It's not typically how I do put it, but I think you're right. It is sort of rooted in what you love, and I think that goes to both of them. I mean, typically what you love is going to be what you're good at, because you're spending so much time. It's a two-way cycle, right? If you do something a lot, you're going to get good at it, and if you're good at it, you're more likely to love it, and so you are typically going to love those things that are your areas of virtue. Typically, if you think back to what really excited you as a kid, what really got you excited, that's going to give a lot of clues into your virtues, because that's something that just came naturally to you. You've just been excited about that for a long time. And same for values, right? What you love, what you admire, those are going to go hand in hand. I think it's interesting to put it into this context of, like, what's gone from the world when you're gone. That's a pretty cool way to put it. And dying isn't the only way that the world could be deprived of your virtues, right?
Absolutely.
This kind of gets into the self-actualization stuff, which really, self-actualization, self-becoming, these are all essentially the same concept in my mind. And it's really what we all, I think, should be aiming for. It's how can I bring my innate self out into the world in a larger, greater, more impactful way. And so, yeah, I think there are, it's a shame for you, and it's also a shame for everyone else, if you can't find a way to bring that unique combination of strengths out into the world and exercise them every day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that breaks my heart the most is when I get to know somebody and I get to know their unique values and virtues that truly no one else has, right? And the unique way that they can bring value into other people's lives through that, right? Through they love things and they're helping other people to experience the value of the thing that they love, or their virtues allow them to create more goodness or quality experience for other people, whatever it is. But everyone does have their really unique way, and I meet people and I'm just enamored and touched by what the unique way they bring value is. And it's just really hard for me, and I haven't figured out a way to deal with this. Honestly, I might actually ask, like, Growth Exchange on Mindfulness for some help with this one. I don't know, like, how to help people to do that sometimes, right? Because there's all sorts of barriers, but often it seems to be, and maybe you would call it a faulty self-appraisal system or something, but it often seems to be just a lack of courage or the willingness to take the risks to put oneself out there in that particular way. And it's I think partly the reason it breaks my heart is because of how I came to understand death, right? Like if death is for your unique values and virtues to be gone, then for your unique values and virtues to never be seen, to never live out there, is in a way it's to never live. So that just
Yeah.
stresses me out. Stresses me out, man.
Yeah.
Any
No,
advice?
I don't blame you. It is super depressing when someone is essentially dead in some ways in their lives, and you can see that potential, and either they see it too, but they just can't bring it out, or they don't see it. That's what's really hard, is when you can't even get someone to see their own greatest strengths. And so one of the things I talk about is um, essentially there are two reasons why you might be sort of low on this self-appraisal spectrum, right? One is that you're bringing out your strengths on a regular basis, but for one reason or another, you're not getting that signal. You're not seeing it. You've got, like you said, a faulty self-appraisal system where everyone else around you can see your strengths, but you can't. And the other is you actually aren't bringing them out. You actually aren't taking that action. And I think they require different approaches. I talk about the importance of cognitive restructuring. If you've got these distorted beliefs, if everyone else thinks you're amazing and you can't see that you're amazing, right? You have to go through and actually work through some of those cognitive biases. And on the other hand, if you really just aren't living that life, if you aren't living according to your own values at all, and you're maybe just sort of wasting your time doing things that bring only momentary short-term pleasure, that don't really demonstrate any of those virtues, right? Then you have to gradually work your way up to bringing more of that into your life. And that works at a couple different scales. If someone's really depressed, that might consist of just like trying to take a walk every day, trying to go work out, or and kind of taking the smallest possible step to gradually work your way up to the point where you are bringing at least a normal, healthy amount of your virtues out regularly. But then it sort of gets more complicated once you get past that point of clinical low depression, right? Then you have to start asking, how can I restructure my life, my job, my relationships, my work, my communities, so as to better bring out those strengths? And I talk about like your virtue domains, and how you have to think about them, how you have to start making life decisions based on the questions like, which of these two paths will allow me to bring out more of my strengths, right? Which of these paths will limit my ability to bring out these things I'm good at, even if on the surface they seem like better decisions on paper, the job pays better, whatever it is. How can I start how can I get to that higher place on that mountain? And it is really tough when it's someone else and you can't control their decisions, and it's a friend that you care about and you want to just tell them what to do. And frankly, most of the time, what I do is when they express a willingness to do that, when they really want my advice, I get excited. I start trying to help them plan things out. But very often they don't ask for that advice, and I just have to sort of detach and kind of keep my focus more on myself, because if you can't control someone and they're not going to do what you think they should, it's just going to cause you unnecessary pain over time. So,
Of course, yeah.
but continuing to put that opportunity out there, at least for them. But it's tough.
Yeah. And I think what you say around kind of just focusing on yourself, I think that also speaks to actually what are effective ways to communicate to people, right? Like telling people you should do this because this and these reasons. I mean, Mifekril mostly really led the month we did on Mindform about how minds change, right? And how do you effectively communicate? And actually, at church last weekend, a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, did sort of he talked about a controversial issue in New Zealand right now, in New Zealand politics, around well, New Zealand's unique. Our constitutional document is a treaty between the colonizing Europeans and the native people of the time, the Māori. And so there's all this I won't get into it, but there's all this stuff that's changing or could be changing about that right now, and people are coming out with different perspectives, and Christians who were involved in the formation of this treaty are trying to figure out their role. And he just did all of these forms of effective communication that Mefekrel and I have talked about excellently, where he didn't say this is the correct opinion and this is why. He told his story. He poured his heart out. He got really emotional, actually, talking about it. And his story of being someone who didn't live in New Zealand and then came in, and he's working in like a Māori, the native language school, and all of this stuff. And then sort of spoke to the shared values that he had with the other Christians in the community. And it really allowed people to hear what he was saying and hear the truth that he's come to around his perspective on that political issue. And I guess to loop that back into what you were saying is to say that, focusing on yourself and leaning into your journey, your story, and letting people see that, and sharing that and welcoming people into that is going to probably often be a much more effective way to show someone the value of this approach than just telling them, right? And in fact, when you sacrifice the pursuit of creating that evidence through helping yourself for the sake of trying to convince them, perhaps you're convincing them even less than if you'd just gone back and helped yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone needs role models, right? That's a big part of how you even decide what you admire. And so if you can just model this and show people, how to live a good life through your actions, it'll probably speak louder than if they, if you spend all day lecturing them about it. So
yeah,
I agree.
And you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around, whatever the number is in that saying. And yeah, if I had a really good friend who suddenly just and we were all miserable and they started just living their best life and we were still hanging out all the time, that would probably affect my life in a positive way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. We've talked a lot about the self-appraisal system, and at some sense it seems to be innate. I mean, we're talking about the evolutionary build-up for it. We've talked about, it's so deep, even the lobsters have it, and that wasn't a very good impression, but I'm working on it.
I was impressed. That was
okay.
good.
Well, thank you. I have a lot of practice from my 20-year-old, boy days, podcast bro days. So the question is, do we all, one of the things that comes up for me when we talk about this is, do we all actually evaluate ourselves like that? I mean, I know we do. I certainly know that there's variation in the form of self-evaluation or the degree of self-evaluation, right? So, for example, one way I'll just try to paint the picture here is Freud sort of presented this id, ego, superego model, and people have commented that this model is not a model of the human brain. It's a model of the Western human brain to some sense, because of sort of this because it's actually, to some degree, that at least how he described it, the superego works largely in sort of a shame-based setup, and it's kind of, what are the expected appropriate standards of society? What do I want, and how do I navigate that? But that's not necessarily the way that all social structures navigate people's innate drives and allow them to sort of be mutually constructive. And so is it, how much does this approach work for any human brain, or is it going to work better for someone who is actually already the kind of person who's really concerned about how well they're doing in life, and if they notice themselves acting in a way against their values, they feel a lot of shame, and if they do well, they feel a lot of pride? Perhaps that happens to everyone, but certainly if it does, there's a lot of people who have no idea that's happening to them and don't seem to ever notice a connection between their behavior and the way that they feel.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that the theory goes that, yes, this is innate. This is essentially how brains around the world, the humanity essentially has always operated. But you're absolutely right that the form and the shape that it takes will vary culturally. So, for example, I don't think a big part of someone living in like a tribal community on the other side of the planet is that focused on career achievement or whatever. I don't think a lot of their, self-ruminations are achievement focused. They might be far more sort of family focused and honor focused, right? You see some cultures where, this is a huge thing in like Eastern cultures, where family and honor are this huge thing. And like, if you dishonor your family, you have to kill yourself and that kind of thing. I'm probably botching the traditions, but so clearly there are cultures where different values are emphasized and where individuals would have grown up with self-esteem and identity centered around different things. But my understanding of just the human mind and human behavior is essentially that this is how it works, that this self-appraisal system is active in a normal, healthy, really human brain. And whether we're conscious of it or not, we're sort of making adjustments based on it. We're looking at ourselves and we're going out into the social world and we're trying things out in our, personality, and we embarrass ourselves and then we feel really bad and we think about it 10 times a day and we make corrections and we try to prevent that from happening. And that gets at too, like what you were saying about a friend who's, not comfortable. They're not confident enough of bringing these things out. And I saw in the comments, someone said putting yourself out there would have serious consequences evolutionarily. So that's understandable. I think that's absolutely true. We are meant to be risk averse in a certain sense. We are meant to, if we can't confidently take action and take a behavior that we know is going to elevate our status, then at least don't do something that's going to harm it, right? At least don't put yourself out there if you can't rise to that occasion, if your virtue isn't strong enough in that area and you're just going to embarrass yourself. I think that's at least how it works. And my understanding of, the research that's been done cross-culturally is that while, yes, we do place more emphasis on certain virtues than others, we really do share these traits. We care very much about our self-evaluations. We care very much that we have these positive traits that humans tend to approve of universally. So, my understanding is that around the world in every culture, there are active self-appraisal systems. And it lines up too with the fact that we see depression, clinical depression. It's much more rare in some other parts of the world than it is in the Western world, but it is present. It is a thing in all cultures, I think, that we've observed. So,
yeah, I'm sus. I'm skeptical. Perhaps at the root of that system, that core system is at work in all or most people cross-culturally, but I certainly think it has a different form in different cultures and a different form at a deeper level than just what is the social measure by which I'm evaluating myself, career versus my ability to hunt or whatever it is. I don't know how much it is romantic thinking or reality, but you do see people from different indigenous cultures. I think Native American cultures, people have talked about this from Native American culture, that there's sort of there's a different. Well, they say that I've seen it said by a couple of people, whatever, that in the West, people sort of think that a human life has value by what one achieves, what one does, what one adds to society, whatever. But in our culture, people just have value in the same way and a right to exist in the same way a tree or a animal does. Like you're just to be is enough. You don't have to be anything special. Just to be is enough. And perhaps what they're really saying is the values that matter to us are humble, social, relational values, not creation values or something like that. Perhaps that's what they're saying. But a formative book for me was Zorba the Greek. Have you read that, by the way?
No, I haven't.
It's a good book. It's a good book. It had a big impact on me, and I was actually I read it after listening to Tim Ferriss talk about it. But the book talks about, well, it's this character called Zorba who's Greek, and the idea is that he's this kind of like this is the Greek character By the way, eudaimonia, the Greeks, okay? But anyway, his kind of peculiar traits, so that the book is written from this perspective of this one character who's highly ruminative and thinking about who he wants to be and who he wants to become, and I need to be more like this, and he's stressed and stuff because of, I guess, the way that he thinks about that stuff and the amount that he thinks about that stuff. And then he meets this chap called Zorba on an island, I think, and Zorba just doesn't think about that stuff. He's very impulsive. He dances a lot. He feels things fully without kind of having that, or to a lesser degree, having that separate self analyzing and measuring and judging. And it's not necessarily the case that he makes bad decisions or that he doesn't live out his values. It's simply that he takes perhaps a more direct route or a less self-analytical route. So yeah, what's going on there? I'm trying to understand what is the universal part of the self-appraisal system if it's not having ruminative thoughts about whether you're sort of doing well enough, because I think the concern with am I enough has negative consequences whether you are or aren't.
No, I think you're right. I think it's not necessarily a conscious question that everyone in every culture is asking themselves constantly, am I enough? Am I good enough? I think a lot of it is intuitive. A lot of it isn't just it's not just a analysis kind of thing. But to imagine what it would be like to not have a self-appraisal system. Imagine someone who was genuinely, truly disliked by everyone in their tribe or whatever. Like, everyone thought that guy's just an asshole. He smells terrible. And like, this guy's just going out and saying things and doing things like, with truly no regard for what anyone around him thought, just upsetting people, offending people constantly, and not feeling bad at all. Like, no negative emotions are being triggered, no self-reflection or refinement, improvement in his behaviors, right? That person would certainly have some kind of disorder, like a major social learning disorder, or they're a psychopath, right? You wouldn't imagine someone healthy, even in a very different culture from ours, truly not caring about what anyone else or himself thought about him. And that tells me, there's probably a system that's causing us to, experience these negative emotions, experiencing, chemical changes that cause us not to want to put ourselves out there if we can't adapt to that environment. I think it probably is, more social relational than it is achievement oriented, like we've made it here by, innately, because, back in the age of our ancestors, there wasn't necessarily that much to achieve, right? You could bring home the buffalo or whatever, you could cook a meal for the group, but the kind of crazy ambitions that we have in the West, that would have been a pretty foreign notion. But I do think everyone is very sensitive in every culture to what their tribe thinks about them. And that's why we have this simulation determining what we think about ourselves, so that we have a way to adapt to that, so we can improve what other people think about us. If we had no internal simulation or response regulator in our heads, we would just be blind to what everyone thought about us, which would be truly just poison for our reproductive success. And that's what designed our brains.
Yeah, I think you're right. You got me there, honestly. It does sound strange, the idea of not... I mean, it's really just, we need some system by which, if we have things we value, we're motivated to act those out, right? And that's the system. You're asking yourself, am I acting out what I value or not?
Right.
So yeah, that's maybe... I remember when you put sort of the early edition out of your book on Mindform, and we were reading it, and I sent you a message about this, that in some sense, the theory is almost, the virtue self-signaling theory is almost a truism, in that if you value something, that means you feel good about it, you think it's good. And so if you are being and doing the thing that you value, then you are feeling good and you are glad and stoked. And, it's the perhaps my understanding of this, and I'm sure this is a good way of understanding it most of the time. But when I hear you talk about the self-appraisal system, I think about it very much as like a ruminative self-measuring, how am I doing kind of thing, which is not the type of thoughts that all people are having, and certainly not at all times. And I don't think it's necessary to have those thoughts like that all the time, if ever.
Yeah.
But it is certainly the case that everyone feels great to be a vessel for what it is that they value, just by virtue of the fact that it's an immediate experience of what you value, even just from that. So yeah, and that can be understood as the self-appraisal system, I would say, because if there's no evidence, no confidence that I can actualize or I can be what I value or what I imagine other people to value, not necessarily totally separate things, then life's bad and is hard, and I can't really take any risks or put myself out there, right?
Yeah, it is an interesting question though. Like, the internal monologue stuff. I mean, we evolved to use language, so that's a huge part of our brains. It's fully wired in. How much of that is innate, that we are, sort of verbally in our heads criticizing or questioning our value. I don't really know why that would be a Western thing specifically. I don't really know why we would be more likely to ask ourselves, am I doing okay? How am I performing in my career versus, someone else in a indigenous tribe asking, like, how am I showing up to my community, right? How do people like me? How was this thing I said yesterday embarrassing? I don't know that it would be different, or that I would expect there not to be that verbal analysis in our heads. I'm not sure.
Okay. I want to bring in something a little bit different here. I don't want to go into too much, because actually I kind of want to stay focused, and I think we can keep fleshing out virtue self-signaling theory a little bit. But just on this point of, how much variance is there in the self-appraisal system? I read, and I brought this up in a few of these episodes again because it's impactful on me, the Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, and the premise for the entire philosophy, or at least the sort of center that he came to for the philosophy, is that a way of analyzing, conceiving of each other and ourselves that measures what we are, as opposed to like what's alive in us. So, are we good, bad, adding value, taking away value, is like the root of violence, basically. That all violence stems from that, and he proposes, and he does it in a very beautiful way, but also a very pragmatic way, a way of communicating and processing, and he really paints the picture that makes you think it's possible. A way of communicating and processing to each other and about each other that excludes that instead of what am I, what are you, is that good or bad, who's right, who's wrong, who should be welcomed more or welcomed less. It's really what is it that you want, what is it that I want, and what behaviors, as we work this out together, are going to allow each of us to get that the most. What's alive in you? How are you feeling? What do you want? What do you need? What are you experiencing? And what can we do about that kind of thing? And so, values and needs and wants still play a role in that dynamic, but it's a version of it that doesn't measure the value of individuals according to values. You know what I mean? And so perhaps so say that was a possible reality to create, where people talk like that, and one doesn't grow up being shamed for not expressing the appropriate values, and one doesn't in a sort of non-violent community like that, how different would a self-appraisal system be, by your understanding?
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle. My first reaction is sort of that I'm not sure these two different things are, deal with the same area or are in conflict or anything, because, we're talking about interpersonal relationships here. We're talking about navigating personal conflicts and that kind of thing. Presumably these are already people that you love, right? That are you're very close to. You're not really still deciding how to evaluate them in terms of their values. You know them well, and it seems like I don't think that love works through the self-appraisal system, for example. I don't think that you love people in correspondence to how much virtue you perceive from them. I think that when you're still evaluating people in the sort of social arena, you're looking at their virtues, right? You're assessing them according to your values. And then at a certain point, when you get really close with someone, you love them, you not only love them for their strengths, you love them for their flaws too. Like you appreciate everything about that person. And that's sort of after you've crossed a threshold where they enter this very close, intimate relationship status. And so, yeah, I don't think that your response to the people you love should be really based on levels of virtue that they're bringing out. I don't think you should shame them for not, bringing out certain strengths, or necessarily love them more when they bring them out. You should just be happier that they're able to bring those strengths out more. So I guess I don't have a complete answer, but I don't have the sense that that these ideas conflict with the self-appraisal thing. Maybe you have some other ideas on how they might.
Yeah, I think maybe they're in parallel. That's my understanding. I'm not talking about my theory, but here's mine. So we really talked about how there's sort of perhaps these two different kinds of well-being. The self-appraisal system kind, which is pride, willingness, courage, confidence, contentness with yourself, that kind of thing. And I think it is a very holistic state of well-being. I definitely know that from experience, but there's a sort of a qualitatively different kind of well-being that comes from being immersed in something, and sort of having that high. One way dopamine is understood as like a reward anticipation kind of thing, but it's just it's seeing the value of things right in front of you and being really immersed in that. And then I see a third form of well-being that's again different to those three, and maybe I would, in a low resolution way, correlate this with oxytocin. Is that the love chemical? Which is more relational, right? And that's just the feeling of having warmth for another person, feeling warmth from another person. It's the chemical that goes up when you're cuddling your kid and all of that sort of thing. So I see those all as really different, and all as important to a fully flourishing life. I think includes all three of those. It includes deep, loving relationships. It includes playful joy and immersion in life, and it includes living out your values. So, and I see those things as supportive of each other. I mean, if you just go down the character virtue route, you value relationships, and your virtue might be building relationships, and so you're going to do that. You value play and immersion and creativity, so you're going to feel that out in your life. So you're going to get all of that. But I see that sort of I don't understand the mechanisms. It's a low resolution idea at the moment, but I see the mechanisms for well-being as being distinct for those three. And perhaps when I talk about nonviolent communication or the world that Marshall Rosenberg tries to paint with that philosophy, it's perhaps saying it's a world where relationships are more centered on a oxytocin, love, warmth kind of, that system is more at play in the way we relate to each other than the serotonergic or the self-appraisal or other appraisal system. But I mean, all of them are a core part of, you can see all of those as being essential and an innate to human thriving, even from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, it's easy to imagine, right? The drive to pursue and focus and engage is, of course, that's going to be rewarding inherently, and the drive to connect intimately for a social species and mammals like us is going to be innately selected for as well. So yeah, I see those being three separate pathways. But what are your thoughts on that?
I like your theory. I encourage you to share your theory as much as you want to. But yeah,
Thanks.
I once you started, I was hoping you would go there with it, and you did. I think you're right about different systems that evolve for different purposes, different chemicals that correlate to these different areas. I mean, clearly, loving relationships is a big part of our evolutionary wiring, right? It wouldn't work if we didn't have those. And so there, I do think they're parallel systems. I do think, it's healthier to have all of these systems. I do, I would say I'm not fully resolved on whether, what would a life look like that had lots of love and just unconditional love and oxytocin, but no actively virtuous action. It's hard to even imagine what that would be, because presumably you're demonstrating love. I guess maybe like the life of a baby or a very small child who's not old enough to take virtuous actions or be, evaluating itself or even have a self-concept, but it's just receiving all this love and oxytocin. That's sort of what it would be like to just have the love part. And then I guess, I think about some of these ancient philosophers who maybe had the eudaimonia, they had the virtue, they had all the serotonin, but maybe they didn't have any oxytocin, and asking which one is better, or is it best to have all of the systems maxed out, or does it all reduce to virtue? It's a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's no, at least in terms of one's approach to pursuing these outcomes in life or pursuing these processes in life, there's no teasing them apart, right? Like quality relationships and the behavior that's required to maintain healthy, deep, loving relationships is virtuous behavior, and it expresses virtue. I think when we experience intimacy and connection with people, we often enter a sort of meditative or in the zone state, when you're lost in a conversation or you're in the pursuit of a mutual play or task. And of course, virtue encourages positive connection and immersion. So yeah, I think there's no separating them in the practical sense. I think though, well, this just came up for me, like nostalgia, right? Like a lot of people who I think pursue enlightenment, or they talk about trauma healing or whatever. It seems to me like there's a certain nostalgia and a wishing that grown-ups have for what it felt like to be, I don't know, like a 7-year-old or whatever, when not you received unconditional, or hopefully, but for people who did, received unconditional positive regard, and there was very little self-measuring. How well am I doing in life? What are my virtues? You spend a lot of time immersed and lost in play. That's the sort of dopamine pathway. And then you spend a lot of time in relationship and receiving warmth and experiencing warmth, because everyone loves to cuddle little kids and stuff. And so, you're experiencing both of those, but how much is this self-appraisal system at play? Increasingly, I would say, as one gets older. And so I think a lot of people look to the past and the youth, and they wish for that, they miss that. But do you know what? I think people who, when we are able to get our self-appraisal system in check, live out our virtues, and have that form of eudaimonia, perhaps we don't experience that nostalgia. I don't know, but yeah, I think a lot of people have a sense for what it's like to experience non-self-appraisal well-being, and they like it.
Yeah, I think that's a great reflection. And I actually have had times where I would do these journaling sessions where I would really try to get to the heart of what I wanted and really inquire into the sometimes like uncomfortable desires that are eating away down there. And I sort of feel like I arrived at religion independently sometimes during those journaling sessions, because I would say things to myself like, I want to just be a kid being taken care of by my parents, only not the real human beings who were my parents, like the idea of them that I had when I was a little kid, that they were this perfect, flawless caregiver. And And that's essentially what God is, right? In religion, you want to
Totally.
create that parent for yourself, and you want to stop having to try. You want to stop having to earn your well-being, and just be able to finally chill out and live happily ever after. And you know, I guess my response to that nostalgia and that feeling as an adult is, unless we figure out how to re-engineer the brain so that you don't have to do anything to earn well-being, I would say embrace the fact that this mechanism's wired in here, learn how to maximize it, and take advantage of all these different forms of chemical well-being that we get access to, instead of just longing for it to be simpler and not to have to do anything, because it's very rewarding to like you said, to get to wake up and be the person you want to be. There is certainly a part that longs for not to have to try anymore, but you'll be dead someday, so you won't have to try forever. But
Yeah, and it'll be forever that you won't have to try too.
Yeah,
there's a limitless amount of rest that one can look forward to. No need to rush. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree. It is what it is, right? So deal with it how it is. It's certainly understandable that one would long for a reality where they don't have to perform in any capacity in order to feel good. I guess part of what we've been working through in this conversation is that what it is? Is it possible to experience that that well-being without the self-measuring, without the need to perform, with this innate baseline, unwavering sense that I am enough or whatever? But you know what? I've also thought that those things don't have to exist in contradiction or even as distinct pathways. The two things being the self-appraisal system approach, pursuing eudaimonia for the expression of your values, and then sort of constantly being in a state of trying and measuring yourself and the anxiety of that. I think actually the anxiety of that approach doesn't come from playing the game of expressing your virtues. It comes from socially ingrained, possibly flaws in our self-appraisal system, right? Like I don't think it's meant to be an anxiety, or I don't think it needs to be, is probably a better way to put it, an anxiety-inducing process to pursue virtue. I mean, I don't think anything is more conducive to quality relationships and to play and focus, if we're talking about these other kinds of well-being, than knowing what you value and going after that. That's extremely fun. That's extremely playful and exciting. And it connects you to people who you connect with on a really deep level as well when you go after those things, and relating on those terms is incredibly rewarding. So I try to remember that, because I personally, and I've talked about this on Mindful, but like consistent discipline over a long period of time, like I guess continuing to actively play the game of what kind of life do I want to live and how am I going to create that day after day, I kind of get a degree of burnout after a few days or a few weeks or whatever, and just almost actively refuse to play that game. Anything that reminds me of what I value, I'm like, no, kind of self-sabotage sort of thing. That's a dynamic I've experienced in my life. And one of the things that helps with that is reminding myself, okay, the issue isn't doing what I value, or that I value things. That's extremely rewarding. The issue is these sort of prescribed patterns from growing up in a world that doesn't use nonviolent communication or whatever it is, where there's a lot of shame associated to the game, or there's a terror of, oh no, if I don't express my values in this next moment, then something's really wrong with me or something's really bad. You can absolutely play the self-appraisal virtue expression game by just thinking, it's this moment, what do I value, what's important to me, and how can I express that? And now you're in the next moment and you ask the same question, right? And that's possibly the best way to play it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's the avoidance, like avoid the negative outcome of my self-appraisal system approach, and there's also the approach, go towards the high end of it, And personally, I put a lot more focus on that one. I spend a lot more time thinking like, yeah, how can I get higher, get better, right? And feeling pride for where I'm at. I don't, most of the time I don't experience that much anxiety about, oh God, am I enough? Am I stacking up to my ideals? So no, I don't think it has to be an anxious thing. I think you can almost forget about this system and just go after the things that really excite you, and you'll probably end up in a good place. It's only if you sort of forget to do that, which is it's very easy to be conditioned into forgetting that, and just start living a life that society sort of tells you you're supposed to live, that is pretty distant from your actual values. That's when you have to really step back and start consciously thinking about this and say like, I need to make some big changes in my life so that I'm aligning with these values more. But once you're doing that, you don't have to constantly be overthinking it. You don't have to be second guessing yourself every step of the way.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm
yeah,
seeing
absolutely.
all these great comments in the chat. I know.
Deep debate going on in there about unconditional love. It's they've having their own conversation. I've been trying to keep up with it a little bit. But I don't want to get too distracted.
Well, I know there have been some questions for me. Some were submitted before, I think, and then some have probably popped up in here. I don't know if we want to do any of those.
Yeah, I did want to ask. It's definitely come up. It's definitely been relevant for a few times in this conversation. Mufakral asked, before the call on in the comment section on that when we announced it. He asked, if you were a tyrant and somehow had the ability to choose what eudaimonia pathway or pathway to well-being or philosophical framework everyone had to live by, in order to make everyone's lives as terrible as possible, which would you choose? Which philosophy for the way of life? If virtue signaling is what you'd choose if you were a good tyrant, what would you choose if you were a bad tyrant?
Oh man. Well, I don't want it to be too obvious, but I mean, clearly a pretty terrible pathway would be to design a world that got people hooked on immediate pleasures to the point where they were just getting short-term gratification after short-term gratification, and were pretty distracted from their own values and just had this endless stream of entertainment. And I'm just describing the modern world essentially, but I obviously think you could do a lot worse.
You didn't do this, did you, Ryan?
I'm the tyrant. I mean, obviously a world where everyone was somehow incentivized to take the most vicious actions they possibly could. That would be a worse world than this one, right? If you were
perhaps perhaps you use the virtue self-signaling theory, but you just convince people socially that all these vices are the virtues. So people, like, for social appraisal, they do everything that's exactly the opposite of their own personal self-appraisal and what they actually value.
Yeah, just try to
that might be the way to go.
Suffering
that
as possible.
Yeah.
So that's about the worst I can imagine. But those are far-fetched scenarios. I think in society today we deal with very real and in some ways escalating situations that do pull us away from eudaimonia and from our own values. And so I think that's a real concern, just the way technology and the economy and entertainment essentially conspire to distract us from what actually really matters for our well-being and our own approval.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of sounds a bit smug, maybe. So, apologies to people who know me listening to this, but I think about, we sort of talked about before. Well, is this something that everyone does, though? Self-appraisal, different people. Some people seem to not really think about their own actions, or at least not know the connection, right? But I think that's what it is. It's that this is a system that's going on, but there isn't an understanding that that's what's going on, and that's why people are miserable, why people are happy. And obviously the whole point of you laying this out is to understand that and communicate to that to people, so that when they're trying to play the game of how do I love my life, how do I feel great, how do I have eudaimonia, whatever, they're playing the game that's actually going on within them, as opposed to some other false map that they're walking along and getting lost in their own psyche, right? So, cool, good on you with that one. And but yeah, you wonder. Now, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, sometimes you just
It hasn't
think
gotten
that
smug yet, so
no, it hasn't gotten smug yet. I know. So I used the smug to try to find where was I. I was like, okay, what was the smug thought? But thinking about people, there is a lot of people. I mean, it's a big world. You see some crazy people do some crazy things who seem to just have no, seem to have no self-awareness or no desire to express virtue. And, that's probably more something that happens in moments than across people's whole lives. You never know someone's whole life. But you wonder what's going on there. And I think what the tyrant would do is a bit of what it is, that we don't, at a social level, we don't communicate this understanding of what well-being is. And you get people who are miserable and they're pursuing and they're doing all of these things to try to be less miserable, but because of them, the false advertising or whatever about what's going to make them happy, the things they're doing to try to feel better are things that are not positive to their self-appraisal system, whether it's people cheating on their partners or committing petty crime that is actually harmful to people, or drugs or partying, or kind of selling your sexual market value on social media, or whatever it is, just all of these really tangential approaches to well-being that people seem to be pursuing with passion and be miserable. And it's so sad that, and this is where it sounds smug, it's so sad people don't know. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they are doing, It's like, but yeah, that's what's going on, right? It's that everyone has the system, but that's not the language we have. People aren't raised to understand that this is what's if you want to feel good, this is how you do it.
Right. Yeah. It's not necessarily obvious. That's the first layer, is we didn't necessarily evolve to understand our own self-appraisal system. The second layer is that, society actively misleads us in many ways and points us in directions that aren't aligned with this. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the examples you gave are pretty complicated. It's not always as simple as just they don't understand in terms of the map. I mean, people are having affairs because potentially, their primary partner doesn't enable them to bring out their virtues the way they'd like, and maybe this new partner does, and that's in some ways really, really exciting and feels right, but also clashes with their values. And the petty theft and the selling their sexual value on social media, it's like, these people also, we also live in a world where we have to make money and we have to provide and earn our survival, essentially. And that, in some ways, that has to come before the virtue self-actualization stuff that comes later. So it's certainly
I knew I was
complicated,
smug.
But
called me out.
Mildly smug. No. But I absolutely think that if I could get one thing out to the world, it would be this map, this model for navigating your life. And particularly when I see like really, really wealthy, really powerful people who I just wish I could hand them my book and get them to read it, because I see them making decisions like that. The biggest yacht in the world, it's really not even slightly going to increase your overall well-being. That's just not how the system works. That's going to be exciting for a couple days, and maybe a month tops. But no, you can go ahead.
No, that's awesome, man. And that's probably a great point to sort of start coming to the close of the call, because we've been on here for about 90 minutes. But I did want to say I saw this really interesting, and you'll never know if it was nonsense or not, really. But this was a couple of years ago, maybe a year or two after the whole Epstein thing. right? And someone's talking online, oh, I worked in security and I eventually somehow ended up working for these guys because I was desperate and it was a lot of money, and then I got kind of trapped in that. And he heard Jeffrey Epstein be really depressed and go on these rants, and he's constantly like, oh, saying, oh, I'm doing everything right to try to feel really good, like all of these evil crimes he does that he thinks feel good, and
Right.
and I'm so miserable. And again, who knows if this is a real story, but this apparent security guard or whatever he was was like, oh, I didn't have the guts, but I wish I'd just told him, hey, have you tried like a different approach to feeling good, like maybe being a decent human being or or whatever, like,
Yeah.
you'd like, I actually felt bad for him because he was causing so much harm to himself and a lot of other people by having just this really false map of what a good life is and how to pursue it. And his failings in combination with his power would make him do more and more harmful things in the desperation of that pursuit. That was, interesting if that was real, but who knows? And but I do think about that. I think about the same thing with these powerful people. I mean, when you were talking earlier about, hey, imagine if someone didn't have a self-appraisal system at all. This is what they'd be like. I was just a few names and faces came to mind in politics and that. So,
Right.
yeah, and you just think you guys are not. You're not happy. What are you doing? You're confused. Yeah, so that's distressing. But I love that message, that final message. Like, if you could do one thing, it's just get the message across. This is how it works. And if you want to, which you do, everyone does. If you want to feel great, if you want to have a good life, if you want to feel proud of your life, and that this is the way to do it instead of whatever nonsense you're doing instead. And yes, I think that, of course, as with anything, it would make the most difference if the most powerful people were doing that.
Yeah. Imagine if we were able to go back in time and just teach these principles to little Epstein. Maybe it never would have happened.
Oh, it's like that talking of smug, it's like that do you remember when there was this woman who posted like a video, and it was her like pretending to talk to Putin and being like, your mum didn't love you unconditionally, but I do. The same thing, right? It's like they just needed somebody to show them the way. Right. If only I was in Putin's position. If only I was Jeffrey Epstein's dad. Don't crop that and take it out of context, listeners. To raise them right.
Yes.
Anyway, okay. I think that's a good place. I think that's a good place to end this call. It's been really good, Ryan. Thank you so much for getting into the weeds with this. And I think we managed to go a little broader, expand a little bit. Maybe my last quick question to you would be, what do you think the next iteration of, because you're always thinking, you're always learning more, you're always integrating new ideas. What do you anticipate the next iteration of this macro theory of how to approach well-being will include? How's it going to change?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. We talked a lot about different neurochemicals today, and admittedly, I'm not a neuroscientist, and I know we are dramatically oversimplifying how these systems work. I really would like to increase my understanding of how this all works, because the more I learn about it, the more I start sort of trying to map on different neurochemical patterns onto different life patterns and understand why people take the paths they do. I see a potential book in the future that I'm sort of referring to as pathways, to refer to both the neurochemical pathways that we're sort of carving out through our decisions and also the different paths we take in our lives. And I think I could have some really, if I could really dedicate the time to this, I think it would be really fruitful. It would really advance my understanding of well-being and also just human behavior in general. And so I see that as a potential next step once I get the time to sit down and do a lot more reflection and research. So keep an eye out for that.
That's exciting. I mean, just a higher, more detailed resolution, like picture of exactly what's going on in these shifts in well-being could be very interesting. Yeah, I look forward to seeing where you go with that. And yeah, with that, that's our 13th recording, at least, of the Mindform podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Ryan. I just want to say to the Mindful members who've been here live in the chat, Mike, Mufakrul, Vin, River, was that it? I think. Oh, and John. Yeah. These guys have really added a lot to the conversation. So yeah, please come again and ask the questions. It makes it a lot more fun. Thanks everyone
Can we save these so I can like read them and respond to them later?
It'd be cool let's see if we can figure out how to sometimes put messages up on like the final recording that we publish as well. That could be kind of cool, so that listeners can see. I had to go, I couldn't figure it out. But anyway, thanks everyone for being here. I had a lot of fun. Until next time.
A lot of fun.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychotechs, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.